Okay, so this is the leaflet that you will typically find in your box. We put this in every box that we send out as distributors. So every pair of shoes that comes into the UK is sold via us, and we put this leaflet into the box so that it reaches you with all the right information. It tells you a bit about the benefits there on the front, and then some of the do's and don'ts on the back. We are aware that some of our retailers take these out, which is fair enough, but hopefully they replace them with something very similar. Anyway, what I am about to do is to go through each of these points so that you've got a good understanding as to why we explain, or I should say why we advise that this is the best way to transition. Okay, so without further ado. Right, so tip number one, starting on the left-hand column, always. So it says always take your time to transition months rather than weeks. Okay, so why is that? Well, first off, there's three components of your musculoskeletal function that need to adapt when you switch techniques from running in a running shoe, which of course most people have used sports shoes and running shoes throughout their childhood and into their adult years, and so you've developed a running technique associated with that. And so, for example, recent research published in May of 2014 showed that 94% of people wearing running shoes strike the ground with the heel. But what we know is that when people take their shoes off, they tend to move towards striking the ground with the forefoot or with the midfoot. So they're actually running in a different style. And what that means is that you're putting different stresses onto the system. Now, first off, why do they change to this forefoot strike? Well, that's because the nervous system adapts almost instantaneously in most people, not in everyone, but in most people, it adapts almost instantaneously to having no cushioning under the foot. So what it does is it changes the way you run. So you land much more softly on the ball of the foot rather than on the heel. So that's the nervous system component. That's the first of the three components. It's an almost instantaneous adaptation. But the second is the active system, or the muscles. So the muscles, most people will tend to put on their 5 fingers or take their shoes off and go barefoot running, and within the space of probably a few hundred meters, they're starting to feel like this is a different sensation, quite obviously, because it is a different sensation. They're striking the ground differently. They've got less between them and the ground. And unfortunately, it generally creates a bit of enthusiasm for running. And so people tend to overdo it on their first run. And lo and behold, the next day they wake up and their calf muscles are killing them. This is because the calf muscles are now being used in a different way. So it's an example of the active system, or the muscles, being used in a different way, in a way they're not really ready for. So just like if you go to the gym and you really overtrain a muscle, it will get sore the next day, and it may be sore for several days afterwards. Well, the same thing happens when you go barefoot. So that's the muscular system. Now, typically muscular adaptation won't really begin to kick in effectively until at least 6 to 8 weeks down the line, and for many people that adaptation will continue progressively beyond that, so 12, 16 weeks or so. So that's the second system. You've got the neural system, or the nervous system, first, the active or the muscular system second, and the last is the passive system. So that is your connective tissues. It's things like your Achilles tendon, your plantar fascia, all of the little joints in the foot. You've got 33 joints in the foot, most of which don't move very much in a standard running shoe or a standard walking shoe. Suddenly, if you go barefoot or you go in a minimalist shoe like the Vibram Fivefingers, suddenly all 33 joints are moving through their full range of motion, and this is something they're not used to. So the connective tissues, they will take a long time to adapt. The reason being that they have a very poor blood supply. So it's classic, if you get a connective tissue injury, it takes a long time to heal. Well, in this case, hopefully you're not going to get an injury because you're going to take it progressively. But the point is that it will take a minimum of 6 months for most people's connective tissues to adapt, and as much as 18 months in some cases. So there are some caveats to that, of course, but in general, you're looking at a minimum of a 6-month transition time for your connective tissues to adapt to barefoot or minimalist running. So that's point one. Point two, remember, the more injured, fatigued, or deconditioned you are, the longer it will take. Well, quite clearly, if you're someone who is going into barefoot running, you're completely fit, you've got no aches or pains, you are going to adapt a lot quicker than someone who, of course, has injuries, strains, compensated gait patterns, dysfunctional core, that kind of thing. So the point is not everyone is starting at the same point. Many people switch to barefoot or minimalist running because they've got an injury and they think it may help them. So this is an important consideration, that if you're injured, it's likely to take you a little longer, so you need to be patient. That brings us to point 3. So point 3, always listen to what your body is telling you. Pain is an indicator to stop. And one of the classic things with runners, one of the classic things with type A personalities, is that they want to get it done, and they want to get it done quick. And runners especially are very addicted to running. They're addicted to the pain sometimes of running, but they're also addicted to the pleasure, the runner's high. And what can happen is you can get confusion between what is a runner's high, in other words, the pain of running and the endorphins that are released as a result of that, and the pain of an eagle or an injury. So a lot of runners do run through that pain as part of their pleasure, in a way, and ultimately what that can do is that can lead to quite serious problems, things like stress fractures. So it's really important to listen to the body and to be aware of what it's telling you. You've really got to treat this like it's a new exercise, a new sport, and just like any other sport, if you started going to the gym, you wouldn't go in and start Olympic lifting at the top end with the top weights. You would gradually build up to that across months and years. So you really got to look at barefoot running in the same way. So, brings us on to point 4. That is, always start at 10% of your normal distance or volume and progress by up to 10% per fortnight. Now that sentence is a little bit ambiguous. It's a kind of traditional progression, a very generic progression that often you'll find in conditioning books, which says start at 10% of what you used to do in your running shoes and build it up by 10% per week. Well, we've adjusted that to say roughly, or up to 10%, so it could be 5%, it could be 2%, but we've suggested per fortnight. Why have we said per fortnight? Well, 10 lots of 1 week is only 10 weeks, it's not even 3 months, and we know connective tissue is going to take longer than that to adapt. So 10 lots of 2 weeks, you're getting closer towards the 6-month mark. If you're not improving by 10% per week, per fortnight I should say, that's not a problem. Okay, just take it easy, enjoy the running, and the rewards at the end will be worthwhile. So another always, point 6, always run as if you were barefoot, even if you're in minimalist shoes. One of the most common mistakes that people make when they use something like the Vibram Fivefingers is that they forget that they have essentially a bare foot, but with a little bit of covering of rubber. They kind of run a bit more like they're in a running shoe. And what I mean by that is occasionally they'll start to heel strike. That's quite unusual because you feel it. But people, when they're fatigued or when they're not paying attention, may start to heel strike. So that's one thing to be aware of. And that's especially important on hard ground. Not as important if you're on softer ground, but that's another discussion. But the other thing that they tend to do is to overstride. So overstriding is where you're essentially bounding along like a gazelle rather than moving more smoothly, okay, and gliding along. So what I would say with that one is that the simplest way to be aware of that is to use a metronome or to use music like the music that we mentioned right up the front by Barefoot Audio, which essentially gives you the right tempo to run at. That prevents you from overstriding. It tends to encourage a forefoot strike. It's almost impossible to heel strike when you're running at a high tempo. And so that solves that issue. Now, if you don't have any of those, another simple way to do it is that if you're running through a forest, pay attention to everything on the ground. Pay attention to the roots, pay attention to the sticks. You should be doing that anyway as a minimalist runner. But the thing is if you can't distinguish whether a stick is a stick or a snake until it's too late, then either you need glasses, which is one possibility, or you've got too much bounce, you've got too much up and down movement in your stride. So try taking a much quicker, lower trajectory kind of stride, and what you find is that you can focus better. Of course, if you're not in a forest, if you're running around the streets, then do the same, but pay attention to number plates, pay attention to road signs. You should be able to read them from a decent distance away, perhaps 20 meters or so. If you're only seeing it in the last 5 or 10 meters, you've probably got too much up and down movement. And you can simply test this just by tapping your head and trying to focus on anything at the other side of the room. And what you'll notice is that even a light tap like that is very difficult to focus. So when you've got too much up and down movement, you get that kind of jarring. You can't focus on what you're looking at. Okay. So the last point on the always side, that is point 7, and it is to always run silently. So by running very quietly, what it does is it softens the blow. It means that you're much more likely to point your toes a little bit, as if you're creeping up on someone. But it also means you're much less likely to take long bounding strides. You're likely to take little, smaller, shorter strides. And if you think about it from an evolutionary point of view, there's very few creatures that move with a loud thudding gait. And if they are moving in that way, it's normally because they're either top of the food chain or they are almost impenetrable on the food chain. Elephants, rhinos, maybe some horses, but even horses walk quite quietly on the grass. It's only when they start to run, the inevitable thud that you get. But for human beings, we're quite low down on the food chain when we don't have guns and spears and so on. So for millions of years that would be the case, and we'd have to move very quietly, not only to hunt but also to avoid being hunted. So that's the always side. Moving on to the never side, what we've got is never think you can run your normal distance at first. Well, we've explained why some of that may be. In particular, what tends to happen is people feel the lightness of the run. They feel more springy when they're barefoot or in minimalist shoes, and it's a joyful sensation. And so what they tend to do is they tend to want to run further. They kind of discover this new joy of running, and so the temptation is to go for the same distance you normally would do. But as I explained right up front, the very first point is that your connective tissues and your muscles certainly will not thank you for that. So take it easy, use that 10% rule, listen to your body, and you should be fine. Point number 2 on the never side. Never assume because you're already a forefoot striker, you can adapt instantly. Now, of course, if you are a forefoot striker, a lot of athletes, especially faster athletes, will forefoot strike naturally. But as I mentioned earlier, the research from last year said that actually 94% of people heel strike. Now that's a much higher figure than we believed was the case. In fact, most research prior to that thought it was about 70 or 80% of people heel strike, and then probably around 15 to 20% midfoot strike and maybe 5% forefoot strike. But the more recent research suggests that actually practically everyone heel strikes. So the point here is that if you're striking the ground with a heel and you've been doing that for years, then again your connective tissues, your muscles will have adapted to that, and they won't be adapted for the forefoot strike. So this is going to take a little while for you to adapt. If you are a forefoot striker, one of the stories that we've got from one of our elite athletes is that actually even though they had been running on the forefoot, they switched to Newton running, they've been doing running in socks on the track, and they thought they were forefoot striking. They were forefoot striking, but they weren't forefoot striking as much as when they put on the Fivefingers. So they've been using Newtons for maybe a year or two, and running on the forefoot, they switched to Fivefingers, and suddenly they're getting delayed onset muscle soreness in the calves. So essentially they've gone from a certain amount of forefoot strike to an even greater amount of forefoot strike. And in fact, the research seems to indicate that if you then took your shoes off and went fully barefoot, you're likely to go to even more forefoot strike as a barefoot runner. So it's probably a gradated situation, and that's why don't assume you can just jump straight into it, even if you think you're a forefoot striker. So point number 3 on the never side, that is never run in Fivefingers before you've worn them daily for 2 weeks. So really we always recommend people take time to adapt and to spend some time just essentially barefoot every day, or in a pair of five fingers every day, spending 2, 3, 4 hours building up the duration that you're in the shoe, just so that you start to develop a better sense of what it's like to be in the five fingers. So you start to build some strength in the muscles and a greater awareness. And then once you've done that, you'll be ready to start loading the foot a little harder. So just walking around, you've just got body weight essentially going through the leg and through the foot. Sometimes a little bit more than body weight. When you start to walk, you get a bit of momentum, so you may be getting up to 2 or 3 times body weight, some people say, but most research indicates it's about 1.5 times body weight. Then when you start to run, it can go up to multiples of body weight. Again, some research says as little as 2.5 times body weight, some research saying even 12 times or more than that. Certainly when you jump, it's at least 9 times body weight goes through your foot. So bear that in mind if you're switching to minimalist shoes. Take some time just casually wearing them around the place. Point number 4 on the never side. Never forget delayed onset muscle soreness, or D.O.M.S, peaks 48 hours after your workout. So the point being, you may go for a short run. You may have just got your five fingers, just read Born to Run, just spoken to someone about barefooting and thought, right, I'm going to go out and give it a go. I'm going to do it properly. I'm just going to go for half a mile or a mile or a kilometre and just take it easy. And you might do that, get home, think that felt really good, I want to do it again tomorrow. Well, bear in mind that you won't feel the full effects of that run, the delayed onset muscle soreness, until 2 days later. So it's a good idea to give yourself at least a couple of days off after your first run, and indeed to continue that as you progress your running. So each time you step up your mileage or your distance, give yourself at least 2 days to recover. Okay, so on to the next point. So this is point number 5, and that is never stop paying attention to the ground beneath your feet. So it's very easy to switch off, especially when we've been accustomed to wearing cushion shoes that will protect us from things like roots and stones and sticks and things that we don't see. In fact, I just went out for a run earlier today and I lost attention for a moment and I hit a root, which I just didn't see. And it's painful. So maybe my foot tomorrow will be a little bit achy. But the point is that there's a penalty for not paying attention. So it's really important that you pay attention the whole time. And in a way, it turns running into more of a sport than a kind of means to an end. So whereas before in normal running shoes, I would see running as I've got to get from A to B in a certain time, or just cover a certain distance. And it was really to get fit for something else, for football, for basketball, for cycling, whatever. Now, I really see running as a sport in itself, because you have to pay attention to every footfall. You have to be completely engaged. And if you lose concentration for a moment, there's a penalty. So it's just like if you're playing a game of football, playing a game of basketball. If you concentrate the whole game and you keep your concentration, you're likely to do well. As soon as your concentration lapses, the opposition in that game is likely to catch you out. And in running, certainly trail running, the opposition is things like roots and stones and sticks and divots and so on. So anyway, I think it turns it into also more of a psychological or a nervous system workout as much as it is a musculoskeletal or cardiorespiratory workout. So point 6 on the never side is never run through pain. Pain is designed as a feedback mechanism. It's designed to tell us when tissues are being damaged. And in fact, it's something of a gift. I've got a book called The Gift of Pain, and it talks about certain pockets of the world where leprosy is still prevalent. What you find is that there's all kinds of issues associated with people not being able to feel what's going on in their body. And of course, it's not just with leprosy, it's with other neurological conditions as well. Diabetes is one that we'd be more familiar with in the West, and it can cause all kinds of problems for people with sort of later stages of diabetes. So really use the pain to guide you. That's what it's there for. You should never run through pain. So the advice from a health point of view and in the long term from a performance point of view is work to the pain but not through the pain. That's why you've got pain centers in your brain to tell you to stop. The only time you shouldn't stop is if it's life-threatening. Of course, we try and create that or reproduce that desire to keep going through creating races and creating watches that tell us what time it is and pretend competitors, etc. But really that's a metaphor for being hunted, or for hunting maybe. And so it encourages us to push through the pain. Well, in the early stages of transitioning, I would recommend you avoid that at all costs. So point number 7 on the never side, the last point, is never leave tracks. Well, what does that mean? Of course, it's taken the quote from the Tao Te Ching, which is used by Chris McDougall in Born to Run, which is that the best runner never leaves tracks. And of course, what that really means is that the best runners are so light on their feet, it's almost like they're gliding over the ground. It's almost like they're not touching the ground. They seem so smooth, so efficient. And so that is an image to hold in your mind's eye. And when you feel yourself plodding and when you feel yourself bouncing up and down, that's a little mental check to think, okay, am I leaving tracks here? If the ground was soft, if the ground was dusty, would I be leaving a track here? So you want to run as smoothly and as gently as you can. And that's the key advice on the transition tips.